Hello, and welcome to Amanda Foxoven's EDPS 457 Elaboration. My story begins in high school, and all throughout my high school years I was involved in show choir from the time that I was a freshman to a senior, but my senior year the director asked me to choreograph a number for all of the females in show choir, and at least 2 mornings a week, from January to February, we would meet and we would split up for half of the rehearsal into males and females, and I would take all the girls and we would learn the routine. And using aspects of behaviorism, memory, and self-efficacy, I was able to help the girls learn the routine. My first set of terms I chose were from behaviorism, and they are classical conditioning, stimulus, and response. And classical conditioning is the process of learning new responses as a result of 2 stimuli being present at approximately the same time. A stimulus is the environmental event presented to the learner, and a response is the behavior emitted by the learner as a result of the environmental event. And in classical conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus is first presented to the subject, which elicits an unconditioned response. And then a second stimulus, the neutral stimulus, is then added in conjunction with the first unconditioned stimulus, and before long the same response is triggered by both the unconditioned stimulus and by the neutral stimulus. So at this point, the second stimulus is no longer known as the neutral stimulus, but becomes known as the conditioned stimulus, and the response elicited by that stimulus is now a conditioned response. And relating this to my story, the girls were first presented with counts for the dance, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and movements to go with those counts. And their unconditioned response was to learn the movement that went with each count. Then once the girls had a basic idea of the movement that went with each count, I added music. And I made sure to count out loud over the music, and consequently the 2 stimuli were both being present at the same time, and so before long the girls were able to perform the routine to the music without me counting for them. And this is the result of classical conditioning. And my questions for behaviorism are, would operant conditioning have been a more or less efficient method for learning the choreographed routine? And I said in this case that I believe that operant conditioning would have actually proven to be less efficient, because we were able to move so quickly through the routine and run it again and again and again, and taking time to dole out punishment or praise to individuals would have really slowed down the process, I think. And why was counting used first as the unconditioned stimulus? Counting can be done at one's own pace, and it's much easier to slow down counts or take counts one at a time than it is to take measures of music one at a time or slow them down. And so the unconditioned response is typically the unconditioned stimulus is typically one that's learned easiest. And so in this scenario it was counts. My next section is memory, and I chose the terms procedural memory, working memory, and long-term memory. And procedural memory is the repetition of an action in order to store in long-term memory. Learning how to do things would be procedural memory. Working memory is the component of memory where one holds attended to information for a short time while trying to make sense of it, and it's also where most cognitive processing occurs. And long-term memory is the component of memory where learners store general knowledge and beliefs about what they've learned in school, or recollections of events, and even knowledge of how to perform various actions, which would be this procedural memory. Both working and long-term memory can be broken down into declarative and procedural. When one is first learning to perform an action, it is processed in the working memory component, and if the action is rehearsed enough or is able to be connected to one's background knowledge easily, then the action is committed to long-term memory. And in my scenario, the girls were learning how to perform the actions of the routine, and consequently the information I was providing to them was being processed through their procedural working memory. And we rehearsed often, and in time the girls were able to commit more and more of the routine to their long-term memory. And every day we rehearsed, and the girls needed to begin processing the information through their working memory again and recall it, and then they also needed to process the new actions being taught through their procedural working memory. And it was in this way that I worked to ensure that nothing was lost from the girls' long-term memories, that it was all stored. And the questions I have for memory are, was the learning that occurred meaningful, or was it more rote learning? And I said, as time went on, there was meaningful learning occurring on some level because the girls needed to connect the movements with those that they had already learned to make the routine work. But most of the learning was probably rote learning because it was simply maintenance rehearsal. And was there any way that I could have had more meaningful learning take place? I said, as a whole, probably not. Not all of the girls had the same background knowledge, and so I couldn't know that they were connecting it necessarily to some schemata they may have already developed. But I could have, and I did try to use names and moves like step ball change, grapevine, pas de bourrée, things like that to make it easier for those girls who did have previous dance knowledge. And in order to make this all fit, I have to cut it into 2 videos. So to see the rest of my presentation, you're going to have to go to video number 2.